Have you ever driven through Alaska's frozen highways at 3 a.m. completely alone? Tonight, we're covering 9 disturbing true stories from truckers who haul freight across Alaska's most isolated routes. These incidents happened between 1998 and 2024 on the Dalton Highway, Richardson Highway, and remote supply roads. Names and identifying details have been changed for privacy, but these events are real. What's the creepiest thing you've experienced while driving at night? Drop your location and time in the comments below. Don't forget to subscribe to Unheard Fears for more true horror stories. My name is Grady, and I've been hauling freight across Alaska for 15 years now. I've seen whiteouts that lasted 3 days, temperatures that dropped to 50 below, and roads so empty you'd swear you were the last person on Earth. But nothing, and I mean nothing, prepared me for what happened on the Richardson Highway in November 2003. I was making a routine southbound run from Fairbanks to Valdez, hauling refrigerated goods that needed to reach the port by morning. The weather had turned nasty about an hour out of Glen Allen, with heavy snow reducing visibility to maybe 30 feet at best. It was just past midnight when I first noticed the headlights behind me, appearing suddenly in my mirrors, like they'd materialized out of the storm itself. At first, I didn't think much of it. Another trucker making the same run, probably grateful to have someone ahead breaking through the worst of the snow. But after 20 miles, something started to feel wrong. Those lights stayed exactly 200 feet behind me, never closing the gap, never falling back. I'd speed up on the straightaways, and they'd match my speed perfectly. I'd slow down on the curves, and they'd maintain that precise distance, like we were connected by an invisible tether. I tried reaching out on Channel 19, the standard trucker frequency, keying the mic and asking if the driver behind me could hear me. Nothing but static came back, that distinctive crackling that happens in heavy weather when radio signals scatter and die. But the lights kept following, unwavering in their position. I told myself it was just another professional driver, someone who knew these roads well enough to maintain safe spacing even in brutal conditions. Except the spacing was too perfect, mathematically precise in a way that felt increasingly unnatural as the miles rolled past. I'd driven these highways long enough to know that maintaining exact distance through elevation changes and curves isn't just difficult, it's essentially impossible when visibility is this bad. You can't see the vehicle ahead clearly enough to judge distance with that kind of accuracy. And yet those headlights never varied, not by a single foot. The temperature gauge inside my cab started dropping around 1:30 in the morning, despite the heater running at full blast. I watched it fall from a comfortable 72 degrees to 60, then to 55, then down to a bone-chilling 48. My breath started fogging in front of my face, something that had never happened in 15 years of winter hauling. I cranked the heater higher, but it made no difference. The cold seemed to be seeping in through the walls themselves, bypassing the insulation and the heating system like they didn't exist. And that's when the smell hit me, sharp and metallic, like copper wire burning, mixed with the acrid tang of ozone you get right before a lightning strike. It filled the cab so completely I could taste it on my tongue, making my teeth ache and my sinuses burn. I cracked the window, thinking maybe carbon monoxide was leaking from somewhere, but the smell didn't dissipate. If anything, it got stronger, and the frigid air that poured in just made the temperature drop even lower. I kept checking my mirrors, watching those headlights maintain their impossible position, and now I started noticing other things that weren't right. The lights themselves looked wrong somehow, too steady, too bright, with none of the slight variations you'd expect from road vibrations or wind buffeting. They burned with an intensity that seemed to pierce straight through the falling snow without any diffusion or scatter, and the engine noise started sounding strange, like an echo of my own diesel engine but pitched slightly lower, creating this dissonant harmonic that made my skull vibrate. I turned off my radio completely just to hear better, straining to identify the sound, but it seemed to be coming from everywhere and nowhere at once. More a vibration I could feel in my bones than something I was actually hearing with my ears. By 2:15, I'd covered nearly 90 miles with those lights behind me, and my hands were shaking on the steering wheel from more than just the cold. The rational part of my brain kept trying to explain it away. Another driver, strange weather conditions, my imagination running wild from too many hours on the road, but my gut knew better. Something was fundamentally wrong with the vehicle following me, wrong in a way that violated basic physics and common sense. I made the decision to pull into Glen Allen Fuel and Service, a truck stop I'd used dozens of times over the years. Maybe I could lose whoever was following me, or at least get a good look at them under the station lights and confirm they were just another trucker, and I was being paranoid. I took the exit at 2:47 in the morning, pulling slowly into the station lot, and watched my mirrors as those headlights followed me off the highway. But instead of pulling up to the pumps or finding a parking spot, the vehicle stopped at the exact edge where the station's floodlights met the darkness beyond. Just stopped cold, maybe 50 yards away, engine still running based on the exhaust I could see pluming in the frigid air. The headlights were still on, but now they'd gone dark somehow, extinguished, while the vehicle clearly still had power. I sat there staring at my mirror, trying to make out any details, and that's when I saw the silhouette in the driver's seat, a dark shape that was definitely human in outline but absolutely motionless, not moving at all. Not even the slight shifts and adjustments every human makes unconsciously. Just sitting there, watching me. I grabbed my heavy flashlight and climbed down from the cab, my boots crunching on the packed snow of the parking lot. The station attendant, an older guy named Vincent, who I'd bought coffee from many times, was visible through the window of the main building, waving at me in greeting. I waved back and started walking toward the mystery truck, my flashlight cutting a bright cone through the darkness. But as I got closer, details started emerging that made my blood run cold despite all my years of experience on these roads. The truck was old, maybe from the late 70s judging by the body style, a Peterbilt that looked like it had been through hell. The paint was oxidized and peeling, the chrome pitted with rust, and the whole rig had that abandoned, deteriorating look of a vehicle that had been sitting unused for years, not one that had just driven 90 miles through a snowstorm. Deep dents scarred the doors and fenders, and one whole section of the trailer looked like it had been caved in by massive impact. I was maybe 20 feet away when my flashlight beam finally reached the driver's side window, and I saw him clearly for the first time. The figure sat perfectly still behind the wheel, and in that moment, I knew with absolute certainty that whatever I was looking at, it wasn't alive, at least not in any conventional sense. I couldn't make out facial features. The window was either fogged or covered with something that obscured details, but the posture was all wrong, too rigid, too perfectly motionless. Normal people sway slightly with their breathing, shift their weight, blink, move their heads. This figure did none of those things. It was more like a statue or a mannequin, except I could feel its attention on me, could feel the weight of its awareness like a physical pressure against my skin. I backed away slowly, not taking my eyes off that window, and headed for the station building. Vincent met me at the door, and I asked him if he'd seen the truck pull in behind me. He gave me a confused look and told me I was the only vehicle that had come off the highway in the last 2 hours. I insisted, pointing toward where the Peterbilt sat at the edge of the light, but when I turned to show him, I felt my stomach drop. The truck was still there, still visible, but Vincent's eyes just slid right past it like it didn't exist. He kept looking at the empty darkness beyond where the truck sat, asking me what I was pointing at, telling me there was nothing there. I described it in detail, the rust, the damage, the figure in the driver's seat, and I watched his face go pale. He told me to come inside, made me sit down, poured me coffee I didn't drink, and then shared something he'd never mentioned in all the years I'd been stopping at his station. Back in 1987, a driver disappeared on this exact stretch of the Richardson Highway during a November snowstorm. His name was Marcus, and he'd been hauling freight south from Fairbanks. just like I was tonight. Search and rescue never found him or his truck, a late 70s Peterbilt with distinctive damage on one side from a previous accident. The official assumption was that he'd gone off the road, somewhere in the mountains, maybe into one of the deep ravines where visibility from the highway was impossible, and the truck had been swallowed by snow and forest. They'd searched for weeks, but eventually gave up. Vincent had known Marcus personally, used to sell him coffee and fuel on his regular runs, and losing him had hit hard. Other drivers had reported strange encounters over the years. Headlights that followed too perfectly, vehicles that appeared and disappeared, the overwhelming feeling of being watched by something that shouldn't be there. I stayed in that station for 20 minutes, drinking coffee and trying to convince myself I'd imagined the whole thing, that exhaustion and weather and darkness had combined to play tricks on my perception. But when I finally worked up the courage to walk back to my truck, keeping my eyes firmly on my own vehicle and not looking toward where the Peterbilt had been, I had to walk right past where it had sat, and there in the snow, clear as day under my flashlight beam, were fresh tire tracks, deep impressions from dual rear wheels, exactly the pattern a loaded Peterbilt would leave. But the tracks didn't lead back to the highway. They led directly into the forest, straight toward the tree line, where no road existed and no vehicle could possibly go, cutting through underbrush that should have been impassable. They went about 40 feet into the woods and then just stopped, ending abruptly in an area where the snow was completely undisturbed beyond them, as if the truck had simply vanished mid-drive or lifted straight up into the air. I finished my run to Valdez, delivered my freight, and drove back to Fairbanks on a different route. I've made the Richardson run maybe a dozen times since that night, always during daylight hours, always with other traffic around. I've never seen those headlights again, never experienced that bone-deep cold or the smell of burning copper. But sometimes, when I'm driving that stretch near Glenallen on a clear day, I look toward the tree line and think about those tracks leading into the forest. I think about Marcus, gone for 16 years before that November night in 2003, and I wonder if he's still out there somehow, still making his run, still hauling his freight through eternal darkness. And I wonder if one night I'll look in my mirrors again and see those perfectly spaced headlights, maintaining their impossible distance, following me through the snow toward a destination I can't begin to imagine. The other drivers I've talked to, the ones who've been running Alaska routes for decades, they all have their theories about what haunts these highways. Some say it's the isolation that does it, plays tricks on your mind until you see things that aren't there. Others talk about the magnetic anomalies in the mountains, or the way the aurora borealis can create strange optical effects. But I know what I saw that night, and I know those tire tracks were real, and I know that somewhere out there on the Richardson Highway, Marcus is still driving, still following, still watching. The question that keeps me awake sometimes is simple and terrifying. What happens if one night I can't shake those headlights, if I pull into a station and the attendant can't see me either, if I become just another ghost making the eternal run through Alaska's frozen darkness? Have you ever felt like you were being followed by something that couldn't possibly be there? My name is Courtney, and before July 2018, I thought I'd seen everything the trucking industry could throw at me. I'd hauled everything from live seafood to medical supplies, driven through blizzards that made visibility drop to zero, and dealt with every kind of mechanical failure you could imagine. Running a reefer unit up the Dalton Highway to Deadhorse was my specialty. I knew that road better than most drivers knew their own driveways, and I took pride in maintaining perfect delivery records no matter what conditions I faced. That confidence shattered completely on a single night near mile marker 2, 6, and 7, and what I experienced in those hours fundamentally changed how I view reality and what people are capable of doing in the shadows of civilization. The call came through dispatch at 11:30 on a Tuesday night, right as I was preparing to bed, down at Coldfoot for my mandatory rest period. My dispatcher, a woman named Patricia, who I'd worked with for 6 years, told me there was an emergency pickup. A disabled research vehicle had broken down at mile 267, with time-sensitive biological samples that needed immediate refrigerated transport to Dead Horse. The urgency in her voice convinced me to skip my rest and take the job, even though every instinct told me something felt off about the whole situation. She assured me it was routine, just helping out some scientists who'd gotten stuck, and the pay would include hazard bonus for the late-night emergency run. I fired up my rig and headed north into darkness so complete it felt like driving through ink. I reached the coordinates at 1:15 in the morning and found a white panel van with university markings parked on the shoulder, its hazard lights blinking rhythmically in the emptiness. 2 men in lab coats stood beside 12 sealed containers, each about the size of a large cooler, and they helped me load them into my refrigerated trailer without much conversation. They seemed nervous, constantly glancing at the road in both directions, like they expected someone else to arrive at any moment. I checked my temperature controls, -10 degrees Fahrenheit, exactly what the manifest specified, and watched my gauges confirm everything was functioning perfectly. The men signed off on the paperwork, climbed back into their van, and disappeared south before I'd even finished securing the trailer doors. The smell hit me about 20 miles into the drive, seeping through the cab despite the sealed trailer behind me. It started subtle, just a faint organic odor that made me check my boots thinking I'd stepped in something back at the loading site. But it intensified rapidly, growing into a putrid stench of rotting meat mixed with sharp chemical preservatives, the kind of smell that coats your throat and makes your eyes water. I checked my temperature gauge obsessively, still reading -10, well below freezing, cold enough that nothing should be decomposing. Yet the smell kept getting stronger, and my trailer's refrigeration unit was running perfectly with no errors showing on any diagnostic system. Around 2:30, I noticed condensation forming on the inside of my cab windows, despite the heater being off. And when I wiped it away to improve visibility, I saw that the moisture was leaving patterns on the glass. Handprints. Multiple handprints of different sizes, as if someone had pressed their palms against the windows from the inside. Except I was alone in the cab, and the patterns were forming on the exterior surface, where no one could reach, while the truck was moving at highway speed. I cranked up the defroster, but the handprints just kept appearing, overlapping each other, some small like a child's hands and others large enough to belong to grown men. The rhythmic thumping started shortly after, a steady impact from inside the trailer, one heavy thud every 30 seconds like clockwork. It wasn't the sound of cargo shifting during transport. This was deliberate, methodical, the sound of something striking metal from the inside with consistent force. I tried to convince myself it was just the refrigeration compressor cycling or some mechanical vibration I'd never noticed before. But I'd driven this exact trailer for 3 years and knew every sound it made. This was new, and it was wrong, and with each passing mile, it grew louder and more insistent. My hands started slipping on the steering wheel around 3 o'clock, and when I looked down, I saw my palms were coated with a thin film of moisture that seemed to appear from nowhere. The moisture felt oily and cold, with a slickness that reminded me of the preservative fluids used in anatomy labs. I wiped my hands on my jeans repeatedly, but the moisture kept returning within seconds, seeping from my pores like my body was rejecting something it had absorbed through contact with the truck itself. I grabbed my CB radio and called Patricia, needing to hear a familiar voice and confirm that this job was legitimate. But when she responded, everything about her voice was wrong. The cadence was off, too mechanical and measured, and her responses didn't match my questions. I asked if she knew what was actually in those containers, and she replied with exact coordinates and delivery times. I asked if she was feeling okay, and she recited company policy about hazardous materials protocols. It was like talking to a computer program running a limited script, and I realized with growing horror that either Patricia had been replaced by someone reading prepared responses, or the person who'd called me at 11:30 hadn't been Patricia at all. Fear turned to panic at mile 223 when I made the decision to pull over and inspect the cargo, despite knowing it would violate protocol. I grabbed my flashlight and crowbar, walked back to the trailer, and broke the seal on the refrigerated compartment. Cold air poured out, but underneath it was that overwhelming smell of decay and chemicals, so strong it made me gag and stumble backward. The containers were marked with facility codes I'd never seen before, alphanumeric sequences that didn't match any university or research institution I knew of. Worse, the seals on the containers had clearly been tampered with recently, fresh scratches around the locks, suggesting they'd been opened and resealed multiple times. My hands shook as I approached the nearest container and used my crowbar to pry open the lid, and what I found inside made me drop the flashlight and vomit into the gravel beside the road. Partial human remains, tissue samples preserved in yellowing fluid, organs that had been surgically removed with precision. But that wasn't the worst part. Some of the tissue had been altered, grafted with foreign material that looked like fungal growth spreading through human flesh, creating hybrid structures that couldn't exist in nature. Skin samples showed deliberate cultivation of something that grew in geometric patterns, spreading from incision points where it had clearly been introduced intentionally. This wasn't medical research. This was experimentation of a kind that belonged in nightmares, not scientific journals. I slammed the container shut and was reaching for my phone to call authorities when headlights appeared in my mirrors. Alaska State Troopers, 2 vehicles moving fast with full lights activated. They already knew. Somehow they'd been tracking this cargo, tracking me. And as they pulled up with weapons drawn, I realized how easily I could have disappeared that night, labeled as just another driver who'd gone off the road in the wilderness and was never found. The troopers secured the scene immediately, calling in additional units and what looked like federal agents. They questioned me for hours, right there on the roadside, taking detailed statements while hazmat teams in full protective gear offloaded those containers and documented everything inside. The full story came out over the following weeks during the investigation and trial. A group of researchers operating illegally in the Brooks Range had been conducting unauthorized experiments on human subjects, using the isolation of Alaska's interior to hide their activities from oversight agencies. The containers I'd transported were being moved between facilities, and the emergency pickup had been arranged through compromised dispatch systems using stolen credentials. The real Patricia had been on vacation that night, and someone had spoofed her identity to make the call. 3 bodies were recovered from a makeshift laboratory hidden in an abandoned mining site, victims who'd been promised medical treatment for terminal conditions and instead became subjects for procedures that were as cruel as they were scientifically meaningless. I testified at the trial, helped put 8 people in federal prison, and collected a reward for my role in exposing the operation. But I quit trucking the day after my last court appearance. I sold my rig, moved to Anchorage, and took a desk job processing shipping manifests where the worst thing I deal with is data entry errors. Some nights, I still wake up smelling that combination of rot and chemicals, still feel that oily moisture on my palms, still hear that methodical thumping from inside a trailer that should have contained nothing but frozen biological samples. The courts called it justice. The prosecutors called it a successful investigation. But what I call it is proof that the worst monsters aren't the ones hiding in Alaska's wilderness. They're the ones hiding behind credentials and lab coats, operating in the spaces where civilization pretends everything is documented and controlled. Would you trust an emergency call that came in the middle of the night, or does something in your gut warn you when a situation crosses from urgent to dangerous? They call me Rylan, and I spent 8 seasons running ice road routes from Fairbanks to Prudhoe Bay before March 2012 taught me that some experiences shatter your understanding of what's possible in this universe. Drilling equipment hauling was my bread and butter. Heavy loads, brutal conditions, isolation that stretched for hundreds of miles without another human soul in sight. The Arctic Circle always felt different from the southern routes, like crossing an invisible boundary into territory where normal rules stopped applying and something older took over. Most drivers talked about the loneliness getting to them, the endless darkness during winter months, the way your mind played tricks when you hadn't seen civilization in 3 days. What happened to me north of the Yukon River Bridge went far beyond tricks or loneliness, and even now I struggle to find words that adequately describe the terror of encountering something that shouldn't exist. Spring breakup season always brought its own challenges. Ice shifting on the roads, temperatures fluctuating wildly between day and night, equipment failures from the constant freeze-thaw cycles. I left Fairbanks on a Tuesday evening hauling pipe sections destined for maintenance work at the oil fields. My rig loaded heavy and my fuel tanks topped off for the long haul north. The drive went smoothly through the initial hours, nothing unusual except the typical navigation challenges that came with hauling oversized loads through mountain passes. Radio signals faded in and out as I climbed elevation, standard behavior for the region where terrain blocked transmissions and the nearest cell tower might be 100 miles away. I'd learned to enjoy the silence, let my thoughts wander, while my hands managed the endless curves and grades that define the Dalton. At 3:14 in the morning, I crossed into the region near the Arctic Circle marker, and every electronic device in my cab died simultaneously. The GPS screen went black mid-sentence. The CB radio cut to dead air, and even my FM radio, which had been playing classic rock on a scratchy Fairbanks station, went completely silent. Not static. Not the normal interference patterns you get in remote areas, but absolute silence like someone had flipped a master switch and killed every signal reaching my truck. I tapped the GPS screen, cycled the CB power, checked fuses and connections, but everything appeared functional from a hardware standpoint. The devices had power. The displays lit up when I pressed buttons, but they received and transmitted nothing, as if I'd driven into a bubble where electromagnetic waves simply stopped existing. I kept driving because stopping made no sense. This stretch of highway offered no services, no pull-offs wide enough for a loaded rig, just endless tundra stretching away on both sides under a sky alive with northern lights. The aurora had been active all night, ribbons of green and purple dancing overhead, but as my electronics died, the lights changed behavior in ways I'd never witnessed before. Instead of their usual fluid, organic movement, they began forming geometric patterns, perfect circles and triangles, and shapes I couldn't name, configurations that pulsed in rhythm with something I could feel more than hear, a subsonic vibration that resonated in my chest cavity and made my teeth ache. The radio activated itself at 3:27, no input from me, no buttons pressed. The dials spun through frequencies faster than any manual tuning could achieve, numbers blurring past in the display until it locked onto a signal that existed nowhere on the standard broadcast spectrum. What came through the speakers defied description, sounds that resembled speech but operated on fundamentally wrong frequencies, mathematical patterns woven through harmonics that human vocal cords couldn't produce. Listening to it felt physically painful, like the audio was drilling directly into my skull and scraping against the inside of my bone. My jaw started aching in synchronization with certain tones, and I realized the broadcast was causing involuntary muscle contractions, forcing my body to resonate with frequencies that biology wasn't designed to process. I reached to shut the radio off, but my hand froze halfway to the dial, paralyzed by a realization that sent ice water through my veins. The aurora overhead was moving in perfect synchronization with the broadcast patterns, geometric shapes forming and dissolving in rhythm with the audio. as if the lights and sounds were two aspects of the same phenomenon. The entire sky had become a display screen showing information I couldn't interpret, and the broadcast was the soundtrack to something vast and incomprehensible happening around me. The smell of burnt copper and ozone filled the cab, so intense I could taste it coating my tongue and the back of my throat, and vibrations ran through the entire chassis of my truck, making the steering wheel shudder under my grip. Time fractured somewhere in that experience. I remember checking my odometer at 3:34, noting I'd traveled 212 miles since leaving Fairbanks. I remember thinking I should pull over, should stop and wait for whatever this was to pass, should do anything except keep driving deeper into this impossible situation. But the next clear memory I have is sitting in the parking lot at Coldfoot Truck Stop with my engine off and daylight streaming through my windows. My clock showed 8:11 in the morning. My odometer showed 309 miles from Fairbanks. I'd covered 97 miles with no memory of driving them, and the sun was up despite the fact that sunrise shouldn't have occurred for at least another 2 hours based on the season and latitude. The fuel gauge showed fuller than it should have been. I'd burned maybe a quarter tank less than that distance required, as if the laws of thermodynamics had taken a coffee break. During my missing time, my hands were shaking so badly I couldn't hold my coffee cup steady when I finally climbed out of the cab and walked into the truck stop on legs that barely supported my weight. Other drivers were there, eating breakfast and talking about weather and road conditions, normal conversations about normal trucking concerns. I wanted to grab them and demand to know if they'd experienced anything strange, if they'd heard broadcasts that couldn't exist, or watched the aurora perform impossible geometry. But the words died in my throat. How do you explain something like that without sounding completely insane? I bought coffee I couldn't taste and sat in a corner booth trying to reconstruct what had happened. I pulled out my phone to document everything while the memories were still fresh. But when I tried typing notes, the screen displayed symbols I didn't recognize, characters that looked vaguely mathematical but belonged to no alphabet or notation system I'd ever seen. The symbols appeared for maybe 10 seconds before my phone crashed completely and rebooted, and when it came back up, everything was normal, except for a new photo in my gallery that I definitely hadn't taken. The image showed my truck from an overhead perspective, as if photographed from maybe 200 feet in the air, parked on a stretch of highway, with the aurora forming a perfect spiral pattern above it. The metadata said the photo was taken at 3:52 that morning, right in the middle of my missing time, and the location tag showed coordinates that didn't correspond to any point on the Dalton highway according to any map I could find. I tried recording myself, describing what I'd experienced, speaking slowly and clearly into my phone's voice recorder. But when I played back the audio, my voice sounded distant and echoing, and underneath my words was that same harmonic pattern from the broadcast, faint but unmistakable, as if the sound had imprinted itself onto every recording device within range. I deleted the file immediately, then cleared my phone's cache and reset all the settings. But for weeks afterward, I'd occasionally hear fragments of those tones in the white noise of road sounds or the hiss of air brakes, brief echoes that made my jaw ache and my thoughts scatter. I completed the delivery to Prudhoe Bay and drove back south, taking vacation time the moment I reached Fairbanks, and spending 3 weeks trying to convince myself the whole experience had been some kind of elaborate hallucination brought on by exhaustion and isolation. But the photo remained on my phone no matter how many times I deleted it, reappearing in my gallery like a message I was supposed to preserve but didn't know how to interpret. And the mathematical patterns from the broadcast started appearing in my thoughts during quiet moments, geometric progressions, and rhythms that felt like they meant something crucial if only I could decode them, like being on the verge of understanding a language just outside the range of human comprehension. I went back to work eventually because bills demanded it, but I never took ice road routes again. I transferred to southern Alaska runs, where radio signals stayed reliable and the northern lights remained safely distant. I sold that truck within 6 months. Couldn't stand being in the cab anymore, with its memories of impossible broadcasts and missing time. The new owner reported no problems with it, said it ran perfectly, never mentioned anything strange happening with the electronics. Maybe whatever attached itself to that vehicle only responded to me. Or maybe I'd just been in the wrong place at the wrong moment when something vast and inhuman turned its attention briefly toward Earth, and I happened to be in the spotlight. Sometimes late at night, I still hear those harmonics in my dreams. Still see geometric patterns forming behind my eyelids. Still taste copper and ozone coating my throat. And occasionally, I'll be driving a familiar route in broad daylight, and suddenly recognize nothing around me. Like I've slipped into a parallel version of Alaska, where the roads follow slightly different paths, and the distances between cities don't quite match the maps. Those moments pass quickly, usually lasting only seconds before reality snaps back to normal. But they're happening more frequently as years go by. I've stopped trying to explain or understand what happened that March morning north of the Yukon River. Some things exist beyond human ability to comprehend, operating according to rules that would shatter our minds if we truly grasped them, and the kindest thing the universe can do is let us forget. If you could know the truth about something impossible you experienced, would you want that knowledge even if it meant never finding peace again? My name is Sterling, and before September 1998, I thought I understood human nature well enough to keep myself safe on the road. 23 years of long-haul trucking had given me what I believed was an infallible radar for danger, an ability to read people within seconds of meeting them and determine whether they posed a threat. I'd driven from Seattle to Prudhoe Bay more times than I could count, hauled everything from canned goods to construction equipment, and encountered every variety of desperate soul you could imagine standing on highway shoulders with their thumbs out. Most were harmless, workers whose vehicles had broken down, travelers who'd misjudged distances, folks down on their luck who just needed a lift to the next town where opportunity might be waiting. I'd helped dozens of them over the years, never once regretting the decision to stop, always trusting that combination of experience and intuition to guide me toward the right choices. That confidence, built over more than 2 decades behind the wheel, shattered completely on a September evening along the Parks Highway, and what happened in the hours that followed taught me that predators don't always announce themselves with obvious warning signs. The run started ordinary enough. I delivered building materials to a construction site outside Wasilla and was heading south toward Anchorage with an empty trailer, enjoying the rare luxury of light loads and flexible timing. The weather had turned cold earlier than usual that year, temperatures dropping into the 30s by mid-September, and heavy clouds obscured what little daylight remained as evening approached. I wasn't in any particular hurry, had no pressing deadlines, and the highway stretched empty in both directions for miles at a time. Around 7:45, just as the last traces of twilight were fading into full darkness, I spotted a figure on the shoulder near mile 210, waving with the kind of desperate urgency that suggested he'd been stranded for hours. Something in me, maybe compassion, maybe habit, maybe just the knowledge that Alaska winters show no mercy to people caught unprepared, made me ease off the throttle and guide my rig onto the shoulder about 50 yards ahead of the hitchhiker. Through my mirror, I watched him jog toward the passenger side, moving with athletic grace that seemed at odds with someone who'd supposedly been walking for miles in the cold. He was clean-cut, maybe mid-30s, wearing a heavy jacket that looked new and boots that showed no signs of serious wear. When he climbed up into the cab and settled into the passenger seat, his first words were a polite thank you, delivered in a calm, measured voice that immediately put me at ease. He introduced himself as Eduardo and explained that his pickup had suffered a catastrophic timing chain failure about 5 miles back, leaving him stranded without cell service or any realistic hope of roadside assistance arriving before morning. The story made sense on the surface, and Eduardo delivered it with exactly the right mixture of frustration and relief that you'd expect from someone grateful to be rescued from a bad situation. We made small talk as I eased back onto the highway, discussing the early cold snap and the challenges of maintaining vehicles in Alaska's brutal climate. He seemed knowledgeable about the region, mentioning landmarks and towns with familiarity, asking questions about my route and schedule that felt like normal conversation between strangers, making the best of an awkward situation. But within the first 20 minutes, subtle inconsistencies started appearing in his stories. References to businesses that had closed years ago, descriptions of road construction projects that didn't match my memory of when they'd actually occurred, geographical details that were just slightly wrong in ways that suggested he was piecing together information from secondhand sources rather than personal experience. I started paying closer attention to everything about him, watching from my peripheral vision while keeping most of my focus on the dark highway ahead. His posture was too rigid, lacking the natural fidgets and adjustments that most passengers make during long drives. His breathing followed an unnaturally steady rhythm, controlled and deliberate rather than automatic. And most disturbing, I realized he hadn't blinked once since entering my cab. His eyes remained fixed either on the road ahead or on me, unblinking and intent with a focus that made the hair on my neck stand up. When we hit a particularly rough patch of pavement and the cab bounced hard enough to rattle loose items in the door compartments, Eduardo's hands never moved to brace himself, never reached for the oh-shit handle, just remained perfectly still in his lap like he'd anticipated every jolt and bump before they occurred. Around the 30-minute mark, during a sharp curve that required me to lean slightly forward for better visibility, I caught a glimpse of what Eduardo had been so carefully concealing beneath his jacket. The handle of a hunting knife, substantial enough to be a serious weapon rather than a camping tool, tucked into his waistband, where it would be easily accessible if he decided to reach for it quickly. Our eyes met for a fraction of a second when he noticed my gaze, and in that instant his entire demeanor shifted. The friendly traveler mask slipping just enough to reveal something cold and calculating underneath. He didn't say anything, didn't acknowledge what I'd seen, just slowly adjusted his jacket to better conceal the weapon and gave me a smile that never reached his eyes. The temperature inside the cab, which had been comfortable despite the cool evening outside, suddenly dropped so dramatically I could see my breath misting in front of my face. I checked the heater controls, but everything read normal. 70 degrees, full fan, hot air supposedly pouring from the vents. Yet the cold intensified with each passing mile, penetrating through my jacket and settling into my bones like I'd driven into a freezer. Eduardo seemed completely unaffected, showing no signs of discomfort, and when I mentioned the strange temperature drop, he just shrugged and commented that Alaska always felt like home to him, a statement that made no sense given the context, but carried an undercurrent of threat I couldn't quite articulate. The smell hit around the same time, sharp and chemical, like battery acid mixed with the metallic tang of blood, strong enough to make my eyes water and my throat constrict. I cracked my window, thinking fresh air might help, but the odor seemed to be coming from inside the cab rather than outside, emanating from Eduardo himself or from something he'd brought into my truck. He noticed my reaction and asked if something was wrong, his tone still conversational, but with an edge now, like he was daring me to acknowledge that things had gone very wrong, and we both knew it. I made the decision then to head for help rather than continue toward Anchorage with this predator sitting 3 feet away. I started asking more specific questions about his broken-down truck, probing for details that should have been easy to provide if his story was genuine. What color was the vehicle? What year? Exactly where along the highway had it died? Eduardo's answers became vague and contradictory, his friendly demeanor cracking further as he realized I was testing him, no longer buying the stranded traveler act. His hand moved closer to where I knew that knife waited, and his questions shifted from casual conversation to interrogation, asking whether anyone knew my exact route, whether I was expected anywhere specific tonight, whether I always drove this highway alone. My mouth went dry as the full reality of my situation crystallized. I'd invited a predator into my cab, given him mobility and access, and now we were miles from any town or service station with night falling and no other vehicles visible on this empty stretch of road. The CB radio crackled with static, and I reached for it casually, keying the mic and broadcasting my location to anyone within range, mentioning that I had a passenger and describing our approximate position. Eduardo's expression darkened immediately, his hand moving toward that concealed knife, but I kept talking into the radio, asking about road conditions ahead and whether any other drivers were in the area, anything to establish that I wasn't as isolated as he'd assumed. When lights from a rest area appeared ahead at mile 2 or 3, I made my move, pulling in with the excuse that I needed to check tire pressure before continuing. Eduardo insisted he'd wait in the truck, but I was already shutting down and climbing out, moving faster than I had any right to given my age and the adrenaline flooding my system. I walked toward the facilities, but kept my peripheral vision locked on my truck watching, as Eduardo climbed out and positioned himself between me and the driver's door. The knife was visible now, no longer concealed, held low against his leg in a grip that suggested training rather than amateur intimidation. The parking lot was nearly empty. Just my rig and one other vehicle parked under dim sodium lights that turned everything yellow and created deep shadows between the pools of illumination. Eduardo started walking toward me with measured steps, still maintaining that false calm, speaking in soothing tones about how we should talk, how I'd misunderstood his intentions, how everything would be fine if I just got back in the truck and we continued our journey together. My hand found my key fob in my pocket, and without thinking, I triggered the panic alarm. The truck's air horn split the night with a piercing blast that echoed off the building and surrounding trees, shattering the quiet and bringing 2 other people running from inside the rest area, another trucker and a facility attendant, both demanding to know what the emergency was. Eduardo froze for maybe 3 seconds, his eyes locked on mine with pure rage, replacing the friendly facade, and then he ran, not toward the highway or into the woods, but directly to the other vehicle in the lot, which started immediately and peeled out in a spray of gravel that suggested this had been coordinated all along, that Eduardo had backup, and this rest area had been chosen as the location where whatever he'd planned would happen away from witnesses and security cameras. The other trucker, a driver named Raymond, who I'd met a few times on various runs, grabbed my arm and asked if I was hurt, if I needed police, if I understood what had just almost happened to me. Alaska State Troopers arrived within 20 minutes, taking detailed statements, while I sat in the rest area drinking coffee that tasted like metal and trying to stop my hands from shaking. The facility's security cameras had captured everything: Eduardo's face clear enough for identification, the license plate of the getaway vehicle, even audio of our conversation in the parking lot, where he'd tried to manipulate me into returning to my truck. Within 6 hours, they had Eduardo in custody at a roadblock south of Anchorage, and within 24 hours, the full scope of what I'd escaped became horrifyingly clear. Eduardo wasn't his real name. He was wanted by the FBI for a string of murders targeting long-haul truckers across 4 states, a pattern that had gone largely unnoticed because the victims were transient, their routes irregular, their absences not immediately reported. He'd perfected a system, appearing stranded, gaining access to cabs, and then at pre-selected isolated locations using accomplices and weapons to rob and kill drivers whose trucks could be stripped for cargo or sold for parts. I'd been the target of the operation that September night, chosen because I was driving alone with known cargo valuable enough to justify the risk. And if my instincts hadn't kicked in when they did, if I'd continued driving past that rest area, I would have become another statistic, another missing trucker whose fate remained unknown for years, if not forever. The trial lasted 6 months, and my testimony was crucial to securing convictions not just for Eduardo, but for 3 accomplices who'd helped plan and execute what prosecutors estimated was at least 11 murders over 7 years. The hunting knife recovered from Eduardo's possession matched DNA evidence from 4 crime scenes, and the getaway driver turned state's witness in exchange for a reduced sentence, providing details that made me grateful I'd never know the full horrors planned for me that September night. I kept driving after it was over, because trucking was all I knew, and bills don't pay themselves. But I never picked up another hitchhiker, not because I'd stopped caring about people in genuine need, but because Eduardo had taught me that evil doesn't announce itself with horns and a tail. It arrives wearing a pleasant smile and speaking in grateful tones, waiting patiently for the perfect moment to reveal its true nature. And by then, it's usually too late to do anything except pray you've made the right choices along the way. If someone you helped suddenly felt wrong, would you trust that instinct enough to act on it even without proof? My name is Kylo, and ice road trucking had been my profession for 11 straight winters before January 2023 proved that experience means nothing when you encounter something nature never intended to exist. Hauling heavy equipment through the Brooks Range, navigating Adigan Pass in sub-zero temperatures, dealing with mechanical failures that could kill you if you made one wrong decision. These were challenges I'd mastered through repetition and respect for the environment. The Dalton Highway taught brutal lessons to careless drivers, but if you paid attention, learned the rhythm of ice and wind and machinery, you could make a decent living in conditions most people considered unlivable. I'd grown comfortable with solitude, with darkness that stretched 20 hours a day during deep winter, with temperatures that made exposed skin freeze in under a minute. What I'd never prepared for was the realization that Alaska's wilderness holds things that defy categorization. Creatures or entities that exist in spaces between what science acknowledges and what ancient stories whisper about in languages most people have forgotten. The haul began unremarkably on a Tuesday afternoon, loading drill pipe sections at a Fairbanks warehouse for delivery to maintenance crews working the North Slope fields. My rig was in perfect condition: fresh oil change, new air filters, tires inspected and properly inflated for extreme cold operation. I'd made this exact run 47 times over the previous decade, knew every curve and grade by memory, could navigate stretches in complete whiteout conditions using nothing but feel and experience. Weather forecasts predicted clear skies and stable temperatures hovering around -38 Fahrenheit, cold enough to require vigilance, but nothing outside normal parameters for January operations this far north. Crossing into the Brooks Range always felt like entering a different world, leaving behind even the minimal traces of civilization that existed around Fairbanks and Coldfoot. The mountains rose in stark black silhouettes against star-filled skies, and the highway narrowed to a ribbon of maintained ice, cutting through landscape that had remained unchanged for millennia. Radio communications became sporadic. GPS signals weakened as satellite coverage thinned, and the sense of isolation intensified with every mile northward. I'd learned to embrace that feeling rather than fear it, finding peace in knowing I was potentially the only human being within 100 square miles, just me and my diesel engine pushing through frozen wilderness toward distant oil fields where artificial light blazed against the Arctic darkness. I pulled into an authorized rest area near Adigan Pass at 1:30 in the morning, following mandatory rest requirements that existed specifically to prevent fatigue-related accidents in terrain, where a single mistake could prove fatal. The pullout was nothing fancy, just a widened section of shoulder with room for maybe 3 trucks, marked by reflective posts and maintained clear of major snow accumulation. Temperature gauges read -38 exactly, and the stillness outside my cab was absolute. No wind disturbing the crystalline air, no other vehicles visible in either direction. I set my alarm for the required rest period, adjusted my sleeping bag in the bunk behind my seat, and settled in for what I expected to be 4 hours of dreamless sleep before continuing north. The scratching woke me at 2:15, a sound so unexpected in that environment that for several seconds my brain refused to process what I was hearing. Metal on metal, deliberate and rhythmic, coming from directly beneath my trailer. My first assumption was ice buildup creating friction, as temperature differentials caused expansion and contraction in the trailer's undercarriage, a common enough phenomenon that usually produced random pops and creaks, but nothing sustained or patterned. This sound was different. Consistent pressure applied with intelligent purpose, moving from the rear axles forward along the length of the trailer toward the cab in a progression that suggested something was methodically examining my vehicle from below. I switched on my cab lights and checked my mirrors, seeing nothing but empty highway and undisturbed snow stretching away in all directions. The scratching paused the moment I moved, absolute silence falling for perhaps 10 seconds, and then it resumed with increased intensity, now accompanied by a deep resonant humming that I felt more than heard. The frequency was wrong, pitched too low for any sound a human throat could produce, vibrating through the truck's frame and into my skeleton until my teeth ached and my vision blurred slightly from the oscillation. My entire rig began rocking on its suspension despite all brakes being engaged and the parking brake set, movement that required tremendous force given the weight of my loaded trailer. I grabbed my heavy flashlight and cracked open the driver's door, letting Arctic air flood the cab and immediately regretting the decision as the cold hit my lungs like a physical blow. Leaning out while keeping one hand on the doorframe, I directed my flashlight beam beneath the truck, sweeping it across the space between my chassis and the frozen ground. Nothing. Just frost-covered metal and the shadows cast by my own undercarriage components. But the rocking continued, increasing in amplitude, and that humming grew louder, resonating in frequencies that made my inner ear ache and my sense of balance falter. I pulled myself back into the cab and slammed the door, heart hammering against my ribs as I tried to rationalize what was happening. Seismic activity, maybe. Minor tremors, common enough in tectonically active Alaska, causing vibrations that my loaded suspension was amplifying. But earthquakes didn't scratch metal with deliberate patterns, didn't produce sustained low-frequency harmonics, didn't stop and start in response to my movements like something was testing my reactions. I reached for my CB radio, keying the mic and calling out to any driver within range, voice shakier than I wanted to admit as I described my situation and requested someone confirm they were hearing me, that I wasn't hallucinating from carbon monoxide poisoning or some other mechanical failure affecting my mental state. Static hissed from the speaker for long seconds before a response came through, another driver named Wells reporting his position 40 miles south on the Dalton, asking if I needed emergency assistance. I explained about the sounds and vibrations, trying to keep my description factual and avoiding speculation about causes, and Wells acknowledged with concern in his voice, advising me to stay inside my cab and wait it out, that he'd continue monitoring this channel in case my situation deteriorated. The fact that another human voice existed somewhere out in this frozen wilderness provided marginal comfort. But it didn't stop the scratching or the humming, and it didn't explain the new smell that was seeping into my cab despite all vents being closed. Wet animal fur and decomposition, organic rot mixed with the musky scent of a predator's den, so strong it triggered my gag reflex and made my eyes water. I checked my cabin air filters, but they were clean and functioning properly, which meant the odor was somehow bypassing my truck's sealed environment and entering through materials that shouldn't permit that kind of penetration. I stuffed a jacket against the door seals and covered the air vents with spare shop rags, but the smell intensified regardless, coating my throat and making each breath taste like spoiled meat. My passenger side mirror showed nothing when I checked it, just dark highway and the faint glow of stars reflected on ice. But when I glanced at the driver's side mirror, my heart nearly stopped. Movement beneath my truck, massive and dark, too large to be any wildlife I could identify. Not a bear. The shape was wrong, too elongated and segmented, moving with fluid grace that four-legged animals don't possess. Not a moose or caribou. The bulk was concentrated differently, and the way it flowed through the space under my trailer suggested something designed for environments human eyes aren't meant to observe. I grabbed my phone with shaking hands and activated the dash camera I kept running during all hauls, rewinding the footage and watching the last 5 minutes on my screen. The exterior cameras showed my truck rocking violently, suspension compressing and releasing in rhythms that matched the humming I could still feel vibrating through my seat. But nothing was visible beneath the vehicle, no creature or entity that could explain the movement, just empty space between my chassis and the frozen ground, even though I'd clearly seen something in that mirror moments ago. The scratching shifted focus, moving from the trailer to my fuel tanks, and I heard metal creaking under pressure that shouldn't be possible, short of hydraulic equipment or deliberate sabotage. Whatever was beneath my truck was testing the structural integrity of critical components, probing for weaknesses, and the methodical nature of the investigation suggested intelligence rather than animal curiosity. I started my engine without conscious decision, some survival instinct overriding caution, and demanding I get this vehicle moving immediately, get away from this location before whatever was examining me decided to escalate from investigation to action. The moment my diesel engine roared to life, everything stopped. Scratching ceased instantly. Humming cut off mid-frequency, and the rocking motion dampened to stillness within seconds. The smell faded so quickly it was like someone had opened a door and let fresh air flush the contaminated atmosphere from my cab. I sat there with my engine idling, debating whether movement was safer than staying put, when my CB radio crackled with Wells checking in, asking if my situation had improved or if he should call for emergency services. I told him the phenomena had stopped, and I was preparing to continue my run, thanking him for staying available and promising to report in when I reached the next checkpoint. But I didn't move immediately, waiting another 10 minutes while my heart rate returned to something approaching normal, and my hands stopped shaking enough to safely operate my rig. At 3:47, with dawn still hours away, and my schedule already compromised, I released my brakes and eased back onto the Dalton, driving slowly and checking my mirrors obsessively for any sign of pursuit or renewed activity. Daylight brought the courage to stop and inspect my undercarriage at a wider pullout, where visibility extended for miles in all directions. What I found made my blood run cold despite the rising sun and rational morning light. Deep gouges in my trailer's metal floor, parallel scratches that ran nearly 18 inches in length and penetrated almost a quarter inch into hardened steel that should resist anything short of cutting torches or industrial grinding equipment. The marks clustered around my fuel tanks and fifth-wheel connection points, areas where damage could disable my vehicle and leave me stranded, and the spacing between individual scratches suggested claws or talons of immense size, operating with tremendous pressure. I photographed everything, documented the damage thoroughly, and contacted my dispatcher to report potential sabotage or vandalism requiring investigation. Alaska wildlife troopers met me in Deadhorse, examined the marks, took their own photographs and measurements, and eventually admitted they couldn't match the pattern to any known species in their databases. The spacing was too wide for bear claws, the depth too extreme for moose antlers or other conventional explanations. They filed a report, opened an investigation that, to my knowledge, never reached any conclusions, and cleared me to continue operations after confirming my truck remained mechanically sound despite the cosmetic damage. I completed that haul and several more over the following months, but I never again used that particular rest area near Adigan Pass, and I never again felt comfortable stopping anywhere along the Dalton where visibility or escape routes were limited. Other drivers I talked to shared their own stories of strange encounters in that region, sounds that didn't match known wildlife, tracks discovered in fresh snow that defied identification, feelings of being watched by something that understood human vulnerability and found it interesting rather than threatening. The official stance remains that Alaska's documented species account for all legitimate wildlife encounters, that anything else is misidentification or exaggeration. But I've got those photographs stored on my phone and backed up to 3 separate cloud services, physical evidence that something exists in the Brooks Range that doesn't fit into comfortable categories, something large enough and strong enough to treat a fully loaded semi-truck as a curiosity worth investigating when opportunity presents itself in the frozen darkness of an Arctic January night. Have you ever looked under your vehicle and wondered what might be looking back? My name is Brianna, and freight logistics had been my career for 9 years, before October 2015 showed me that not every building marked on shipping manifests actually serves the purpose claimed in official documentation. Route optimization, load capacity calculations, delivery timing coordination across multiple time zones. These technical challenges defined my professional identity, and I took pride in handling complicated assignments that stumped less experienced drivers. Remote pickups never fazed me, even when GPS coordinates led to facilities so isolated that cell service disappeared miles before arrival, and backup was measured in hours rather than minutes. Alaska's freight network included dozens of rarely used depots scattered across the interior, seasonal operations or emergency storage sites that might see activity once every few months when weather or logistics required alternative routing. The depot near Cooper Landing on the Sterling Highway fit that category perfectly, at least according to the manifest data transmitted through my company's dispatch system that Tuesday evening in mid-October. The assignment came through at 8:45, right as I was preparing to shut down for the night at a truck stop outside Soldotna. My dispatcher sent coordinates and a pickup authorization for mixed cargo waiting at a Sterling Highway facility, apologizing for the late notice, but explaining that the shipment had time-sensitive components requiring immediate transport to Anchorage. The pay included substantial bonuses for after-hour service, and the location was only 43 miles from my current position according to navigation software. So accepting seemed reasonable despite my fatigue from an already long day hauling construction materials across the Kenai Peninsula. I fired up my rig, punched the coordinates into my GPS, and headed south into darkness that felt heavier than usual for mid-October, clouds obscuring stars and moon alike, while drizzle periodically swept across my windshield. The GPS led me off the main highway onto a service road I'd never noticed, despite driving this route dozens of times over the years, pavement giving way to gravel that gradually deteriorated into barely maintained dirt, pocked with potholes deep enough to scrape my undercarriage if I didn't navigate carefully. Trees closed in on both sides, spruce and birch so dense they formed a tunnel that my headlights barely penetrated, and the silence outside my cab felt oppressive despite the rumble of my diesel engine. 20 minutes of crawling along that deteriorating road brought me to a clearing where a large warehouse structure sat beneath sodium lights that cast everything in sickly yellow tones. And I felt my first serious doubts about this assignment when I noticed the building's condition. The warehouse looked abandoned, metal siding rusted and paint peeling, windows either broken or covered with decades of grime, weeds growing through cracks in the concrete apron surrounding the loading docks, but lights were definitely on inside, visible through gaps in the walls, and one bay door stood open with its interior illuminated and clearly expecting my arrival. My GPS confirmed this was the correct location. My manifest showed the proper authorization codes, and the open bay door suggested someone had prepared for my pickup, even if they'd failed to maintain the facility's exterior. I backed my trailer toward the dock, following standard procedure despite the growing unease in my gut, and the moment my rear doors aligned with the building's entrance, the bay door dropped shut behind me with a metallic crash that echoed through the warehouse. Interior lights cut out immediately, emergency lighting kicking in to provide minimal illumination that turned everything into harsh shadows and pools of darkness. My trailer was now inside the building, trapped behind a closed bay door with no obvious external controls, and when I tried to release my brakes and pull forward, I discovered my engine had died despite showing no warning lights or error codes. I turned the key repeatedly, but got nothing except the clicking of a starter that wouldn't engage, as if someone had disabled critical systems while I'd been focused on positioning my trailer. My radio produced only static across all channels. My cell phone showed no signal, despite having bars, when I'd entered the facility grounds, and the realization hit me that I'd driven into a trap specifically designed to isolate and capture truckers who followed their dispatch instructions without questioning impossible logistics. I climbed out of my cab with my flashlight and crowbar, the only weapons immediately available, and started searching for manual controls that would let me escape this building before whoever had lured me here revealed their intentions. The warehouse interior was vast, ceiling lost in shadows 30 feet overhead, and as my flashlight beam swept across the space, I discovered I wasn't alone. Other trucks sat scattered throughout the building, some parked neatly as if drivers had simply walked away, others positioned at odd angles suggesting panic or forced abandonment. I counted 6 rigs visible in my immediate area, and closer inspection revealed details that made my skin crawl. The trucks spanned decades, models from the early 80s through what looked like late 90s production years, and all showed signs of violence or forced entry. Driver's side windows smashed, doors hanging open on damaged hinges, seats torn and stained with substances I didn't want to identify, even as my mind screamed that those dark stains were dried blood. Some cabs contained personal items scattered as if drivers had been dragged out mid-activity. Thermoses on dashboards, maps spread across seats, CB radios frozen on emergency channels. The trucks were time capsules of interrupted lives, frozen moments when drivers like me had followed coordinates to this facility and found themselves trapped in whatever nightmare unfolded within these walls. Footsteps echoed from the catwalks overhead, multiple sets moving with coordinated purpose, and I killed my flashlight immediately while pressing myself against the nearest truck to minimize my visibility. My breath came in shallow gasps as I listened to the footsteps circling above, searching patterns that suggested the people up there knew someone had entered the building and were systematically checking likely hiding spots. I considered calling out, asking for help or explanation, but the abandoned trucks and blood-stained interiors convinced me that whoever controlled this facility didn't have benevolent intentions toward drivers who stumbled into their operation. The temperature dropped rapidly, frost forming on windows and metal surfaces despite the warehouse being enclosed and presumably insulated, and with the cold came a smell that triggered immediate nausea. Diesel fuel mixed with decomposition, chemical solvents layered over organic rot, creating an olfactory cocktail that spoke of bodies and machinery sharing space in ways that violated every law of both nature and civilization. I covered my mouth and nose with my jacket sleeve, fighting the urge to vomit because sound would give away my position, and kept moving deeper into the warehouse, searching for any exit besides the bay door that had trapped my truck. I found evidence of the facility's true purpose behind a stack of shipping containers near the rear wall, and what I discovered there convinced me that survival required immediate action regardless of risk. Workbenches covered with tools designed for dismantling vehicles, cutting torches, and hydraulic equipment capable of reducing trucks to component parts in hours rather than days. Financial records scattered across a makeshift office showing sales of cargo and vehicle parts spanning more than 15 years. Documentation of a smuggling and theft operation that used fake dispatch calls to lure drivers, into this location where they and their rigs could be processed without witnesses or evidence. The records listed names and dates, drivers who'd gone missing over the years across Alaska and Western Canada, cases that remained officially unsolved because no one had connected the disappearances to a single location or operation. Among the paperwork, I found building schematics, old blueprints showing electrical systems and backup generators, and more importantly, the location of manual overrides for the bay doors that could be accessed from floor level if you knew where to look. The circuit panel was across 40 feet of open warehouse floor, currently being patrolled by at least 3 people based on the footsteps I could hear, but staying hidden meant eventual discovery once they completed their systematic search. I made the decision that action was safer than waiting, grabbed a heavy wrench from one of the workbenches to supplement my crowbar, and plotted the fastest route from my current position to the electrical panel marked on those schematics. My truck's spotlight controls were wireless, linked to my key fob, and I still had the remote in my pocket. I triggered the lights at maximum intensity, flooding the entire warehouse with blinding illumination that scattered shadows and caused the people on the catwalks to curse and cover their eyes, giving me the seconds I needed to sprint across that open floor toward the electrical panel. Someone shouted warnings, and I heard footsteps pounding down metal stairs, but I'd already reached the panel and was throwing breakers with shaking hands, looking for the bay door controls among dozens of identical switches labeled in faded handwriting barely legible after years of grime and neglect. The main bay door groaned and started lifting when I hit the third breaker, rising slowly on machinery that protested from disuse or deliberate sabotage, but fast enough that escape became possible if I could reach my truck before the people chasing me closed the distance. I ran back across the warehouse floor, vaulted into my cab, and discovered my engine started immediately now that electrical systems had been reset by cycling the main power. I slammed the transmission into gear and floored the accelerator, not bothering with careful maneuvering, just getting my rig moving toward that partially opened bay door before it could drop again or someone found the controls to trap me permanently. My trailer scraped the bottom edge of the door as I drove through, tearing metal and causing alarms to shriek. But I was outside in cool October air, with trees flashing past my windows as I accelerated down that dirt road toward the highway. My mirrors showed lights in the warehouse going dark as someone killed the power again, and I drove faster than safety allowed on that deteriorating surface, bouncing through potholes and scraping undercarriage on rocks because staying ahead of pursuit mattered more than protecting my vehicle from damage. I reached the Sterling Highway at 11:53 nearly 3 hours after entering that facility and drove straight to the Alaska State Trooper Station in Soldotna, where I gave a statement that stretched until dawn. Law enforcement raided the warehouse location within 24 hours, finding exactly what I'd described: a chop shop operation that had been luring and robbing truckers for over 15 years, using compromised dispatch systems to send fake assignments that led drivers to that isolated location. They recovered 3 bodies from a concealed section of the building, drivers who'd resisted or fought back and paid for that resistance with their lives, and they matched vehicle identification numbers to 17 missing person cases spanning back to the late 90s. I quit long-haul trucking within a month, sold my rig, and took a job coordinating shipping logistics from an office in Anchorage, where the worst danger I face is carpal tunnel from typing. I testified at trials, helped prosecutors secure convictions that put 4 people in prison for decades, and collected reward money that partially compensated for the career I'd abandoned. But what I can't forget, what still wakes me some nights in cold sweats despite therapy and medication, is how close I came to becoming another name in those records. Another driver who disappeared after following coordinates that led to a facility where civilization's rules stopped applying, and predators operated with impunity in spaces between legitimate infrastructure and criminal enterprise. When was the last time you questioned whether the place you were going actually existed for the reasons you were told. My name is Ricardo, and December 2008 marked the point where my understanding of reality fractured in ways I've never been able to fully repair. Hauling freight between Palmer and Anchorage was routine work, a short run along the Glen Highway that I'd completed hundreds of times over 7 years without incident worth mentioning. The route took maybe 90 minutes in good conditions, passing Matanuska Glacier and winding through terrain that alternated between stunning natural beauty and industrial development serving Alaska's largest population center. I knew every curve, every grade, change, every spot where ice accumulated during winter months and required extra caution. The predictability of that route provided comfort in an occupation defined by variables and uncertainties, giving me one reliable constant in a life spent navigating logistics challenges and weather emergencies. What happened that December night taught me that familiarity breeds not safety but complacency, and that the boundaries between possible and impossible are far thinner than rational minds want to acknowledge. The delivery in Palmer finished around 7:30, unloading prefabricated building components at a construction site that had pushed their schedule into December, despite weather predictions suggesting they should have wrapped operations weeks earlier. I completed my paperwork, secured my empty trailer and headed south toward Anchorage, where I maintained a small apartment, and looked forward to hot food and sleep after 14 hours on the road. Temperature hovered around 15 degrees with clear skies, ideal conditions for night driving that would let me make good time without fighting snow or ice. Traffic was light as expected for a Tuesday evening, just occasional vehicles heading in both directions, and I settled into the comfortable rhythm that long-haul drivers develop when the road becomes an extension of their vehicle, rather than a challenge requiring constant attention. The passenger appeared somewhere between mile 42 and mile 38, though I have no memory of anyone entering my truck and cannot logically explain how they materialized in my cab. One moment, I was alone, adjusting my heater and reaching for my thermos, and the next moment, someone sat in my passenger seat as if they'd been there all along, and I'd simply failed to notice. The shock of discovery nearly made me swerve off the highway, my heart hammering as I processed the impossible situation of sharing my cab with a person who couldn't possibly be there. My doors were locked, my windows closed, and we were traveling at highway speed on a stretch of road with no pull-offs or intersections where someone could have flagged me down. Yet this figure sat motionless in the passenger seat, existing in defiance of every rule governing how reality should function. I couldn't see clear features, despite the dashboard lights providing adequate illumination. The figure appeared as shadow or smoke, outline vaguely human, but lacking definition, edges that seemed to shift and blur when I tried to focus directly on them. No clothing details, no facial characteristics, just a dark presence that radiated malevolence so intense it felt like physical pressure against my chest, making each breath require conscious effort. The temperature inside my cab, comfortable moments before, dropped to levels that made frost form on the interior windows despite my heater running at maximum capacity. My breath clouded in front of my face, and the moisture in my nose froze with each inhalation. Sharp pain that confirmed the temperature had fallen well below zero despite being impossible in an enclosed, heated space. I tried speaking, demanding to know who they were and how they'd entered my truck, but my voice came out strangled and weak, words dying in my throat before achieving full volume. The passenger made no response, didn't turn toward me or acknowledge my presence beyond the oppressive awareness that suggested they knew everything about me while I knew nothing about them. Then sounds began filling my cab without apparent source. Whispers in languages I didn't recognize but somehow understood on a level deeper than conscious thought. Images flooded my mind unbidden. Visions of previous drivers on this exact highway stretch. accidents that had claimed lives over the decades since the Glen Highway's construction. I saw vehicles leaving the road, tumbling down embankments, drivers trapped in crushed cabs while hypothermia slowly killed them, and I understood with horrible clarity that these weren't random thoughts but memories being deliberately shared by the entity sitting beside me. My hands on the steering wheel stopped obeying commands from my brain, moving independently to maintain speed and direction, while my consciousness screamed to pull over, to stop the truck, and escape whatever was happening. I'd become a passenger in my own body, watching helplessly as something else controlled my vehicle and my physical actions, using me as a puppet while my mind remained aware but powerless. The highway unreeled ahead, familiar landmarks passing at normal speed, but time felt distorted, stretched, and compressed simultaneously until I couldn't determine how long I'd been driving or how far we'd traveled. The whispers intensified, shifting from incomprehensible syllables to phrases that formed meaning despite using no language I'd studied. The passenger claimed this highway as territory, described feeding on fear and suffering generated by accidents and deaths, explained that it had inhabited these miles for longer than the paved road had existed, dating back to when this route was nothing but native trails and later wagon tracks through wilderness. It spoke of drivers it had influenced, subtle nudges toward fatigue or distraction that resulted in mistakes, vehicles leaving roads, lives ending in ways that appeared accidental but served the passengers' incomprehensible purposes. The smell that filled my cab defied description, combining aspects of ash and sulfur with undertones of decay and burning hair, chemical signatures that shouldn't exist together, but created an olfactory assault that made my eyes water and my throat spasm. I tasted metal on my tongue, copper and iron flavors that suggested blood, though I'd bitten nothing, and injured myself in no way that would explain the sensation. My skin crawled with the feeling of invisible contact, pressure points on my neck and shoulders, where no physical touch occurred, but the sensation remained undeniable. Cold fingers that didn't exist, tracing patterns that made every nerve-ending scream warnings my body couldn't act upon. Lights from Anchorage appeared in the distance, glow from the city reflecting off low clouds, and I realized we'd covered nearly 40 miles, while I'd been trapped as a prisoner in my own flesh. The passenger's presence intensified as we approached population density, its attention shifting from passive observation to active malevolence, and I felt its intention like a knife against my thoughts. It wanted me to continue driving into Anchorage, wanted me to make deliveries and return trips, wanted me to keep using this highway, while it fed on my terror and gradually eroded my sanity until I became one of those drivers who made fatal mistakes at convenient moments in isolated locations. Then we were parked outside my company's Anchorage warehouse, engine off and darkness surrounding my truck, and the passenger was gone as if it had never existed. My clock showed 11:37, roughly 4 hours after leaving Palmer, though the trip should have taken 90 minutes at most. I'd lost nearly 2.5 hours to whatever had happened, and my fuel gauge showed I'd burned far less diesel than the mileage required, as if I'd traveled different distances than my odometer recorded. My hands shook so badly I couldn't immediately open my door, and when I finally climbed down from my cab, my legs nearly collapsed, muscles weak from tension and terror I'd been unable to process while imprisoned in my own body. No one was visible in the warehouse lot despite it being a facility that operated around the clock. Security lights illuminated empty pavement, and the building itself showed no signs of activity, though I could see my delivery schedule listed vehicles due for morning loading. The isolation felt wrong, as if I'd arrived in a version of Anchorage slightly displaced from normal reality. But I stumbled toward the building anyway because staying near my truck seemed more dangerous than seeking other human contact. Inside, I found night shift workers going about their normal routines. Forklift operators moving pallets and dispatchers coordinating schedules, and their casual normalcy made me question whether the entire experience had been hallucination or mental break rather than genuine encounter with something impossible. I tried, describing what had happened to the shift supervisor, but the words sounded insane even to my ears, and I watched skepticism replace concern on his face as I struggled to articulate experiences that defied rational explanation. I quit trucking that week, couldn't bring myself to climb back into any cab knowing what might be waiting in the passenger seat. I sold my commercial license and took work in a Palmer warehouse where my job involved inventory management and forklift operation, tasks that kept me indoors and away from highways where entities claimed territory and fed on human suffering. I never returned to that Anchorage apartment, paid someone else to pack my belongings and forward them, because driving the Glen Highway again felt like tempting fate or inviting that passenger back into my life. Sleep became difficult after December 2008, interrupted by recurring sensations of that presence in my bedroom, watching from corners where shadows gathered despite lights remaining on throughout the night. Sometimes I wake to find myself standing at my window, no memory of getting out of bed, staring toward the highway visible in the distance and feeling that pull, that invitation to return to the road where something waits patiently for drivers who've experienced its attention once and might be convinced to return for deeper contact. Therapists diagnosed PTSD and prescribed medications that dulled the memories without erasing them. And over years, the acute terror faded into chronic unease that I learned to manage rather than overcome. But I still can't ride in the passenger seat of any vehicle without feeling that presence. Still can't travel highways at night without hyperventilating and needing to pull over until daylight returns. The boundary between driver and passenger, between control and helplessness, became too thin after that December night, and crossing it triggers responses I can't suppress or rationalize away, no matter how much time passes. Other drivers who regularly run the Glen Highway sometimes share their own stories if you ask carefully and create space for admissions that sound insane to outsiders. Strange presences in their cabs during specific stretches, hours lost to drives that should take minutes, feelings of operating their vehicles while simultaneously watching from outside their own bodies. Most dismiss these experiences as fatigue or stress, convince themselves that long hours and isolation create hallucinations, but I recognize the truth in their voices when they describe details that match my memories too precisely to be coincidental. Something claims that highway, or possibly claims all highways. Once enough death and suffering has soaked into the pavement to create sustenance for entities that exist adjacent to our reality, and that something occasionally crosses the boundary, separating its existence from ours, manifesting as passengers who should not exist, testing whether drivers can be broken or corrupted or simply consumed during moments when the barriers between possible and impossible grow thin enough to permit contact. Have you ever felt like you weren't alone in your vehicle, despite knowing logically that you were the only person there? My name is Steven, and after 21 years running freight across Alaska's most unforgiving highways, I'd convinced myself that I'd seen every variation of weird the North could throw at a driver. Temperature swings that cracked windshields, wildlife encounters that defied natural behavior patterns, weather systems that appeared from nowhere and vanished just as quickly. These were occupational hazards I'd learned to navigate through experience and healthy respect for environmental extremes. The Dalton Highway between Fairbanks and Coldfoot had become so familiar that I could drive significant stretches with minimal attention, my hands and eyes operating on autopilot while my conscious mind wandered through memories or planned future routes. That confidence, built over thousands of hours behind the wheel in conditions that killed careless operators, made me vulnerable to complacency in June 2021 when I encountered something that violated every rule I'd learned about convoy operations and trucker culture. The run started normally enough on a Wednesday evening, midsummer light stretching well past 11 o'clock, and temperatures still comfortable despite the lateness of the hour. I'd picked up drilling equipment components in Fairbanks, secured the load according to strict protocols, and headed north with a delivery deadline that gave me plenty of cushion for rest stops and refueling. The Dalton was busy that night by northern Alaska standards. Maybe a dozen trucks scattered across the 415 miles between Fairbanks and Deadhorse. Enough traffic that seeing lights and mirrors or hearing chatter on CB channels felt reassuring rather than unusual. Wildfire smoke from interior burns created hazy conditions that softened distant views and turned the midnight sun into a dull orange disk hanging low over the horizon. Atmospheric conditions unusual but not unprecedented for early summer in Alaska. Channel 17 crackled to life around 11:50 as I passed through the Yukon River crossing, a voice requesting northbound traffic to identify positions and speeds, with the suggestion that forming an informal convoy might improve safety, given the reduced visibility from smoke. The request seemed reasonable on its surface. Truckers regularly coordinated movements through challenging conditions to provide mutual assistance and emergency backup if mechanical failures occurred in remote stretches. I responded with my location and load details, and within minutes, 3 other trucks appeared in my mirrors, closing distance with professional precision and settling into formation about 200 feet behind my trailer. Their headlights maintained perfect spacing, despite minor variations in road surface and grades, moving with synchronization that suggested either very experienced drivers or some kind of automated system linking their vehicles electronically. The CB chatter from the convoy felt off almost immediately, though I struggled initially to articulate exactly what bothered me about their communication patterns. Conversations followed scripted rhythms, jokes that felt rehearsed rather than spontaneous, responses to questions that came too quickly to suggest genuine thought. One driver referenced road conditions near Coldfoot, using language that exactly matched a traffic report I'd heard 3 days earlier on a completely different route. Word-for-word repetition that suggested memorization rather than current observation. Another made small talk about family, using details that felt generic and interchangeable, the kind of background information a computer might generate to simulate human conversation without actually conveying authentic personal experience. I started paying closer attention to the formation behind me, using my mirrors to study the trucks whenever straight sections provided clear sightlines. All 3 appeared to be identical models, despite sporting different company logos and color schemes, unusual given the variety of equipment typically seen on Alaska routes, where carriers used whatever rigs best suited their specific operational requirements. Damage patterns on the trailers matched exactly. Same dents in the same locations, same rust spots spreading from identical points, same wear on tires that should have shown individual patterns based on different maintenance schedules and driving habits. It was like looking at 3 copies of a single truck rather than 3 separate vehicles, and that impossibility made my scalp prickle with unease that intensified with every passing mile. The smell hit around mile 127, seeping into my cab despite closed windows and recirculating air systems. Smoke, certainly, consistent with the wildfires burning somewhere to the east, but underneath that expected scent came something wrong. Burned electronics mixed with organic decay, chemical odors that reminded me of industrial solvents and biological decomposition occurring simultaneously. I checked my engine gauges obsessively, looking for overheating or fluid leaks that might explain the odor, but everything read normal, and the smell clearly originated from outside my truck rather than from any internal mechanical issue. Temperature inside my cab began fluctuating wildly around midnight, heater struggling to maintain comfortable levels despite moderate external conditions that shouldn't challenge the system. Within 5 minutes, I went from comfortable to sweating to shivering, thermometer readings swinging between 80 degrees and 45 in cycles that made no physical sense given the thermal mass of the truck and the limited capacity of heating and cooling equipment. My breath fogged during the cold cycles, condensation forming on windows and dash surfaces, then evaporated instantly when heat surged back, creating atmospheric conditions inside my sealed cab that violated basic thermodynamics. The convoy's CB chatter shifted at 12:17, conversation transitioning from generic small talk to increasingly specific questions about my route, schedule, and whether anyone expected me at particular locations along the way. The inquiries felt like interrogation disguised as friendly interest, each driver probing different aspects of my situation in patterns that suggested coordination rather than independent curiosity. When I gave vague responses or deflected questions, their tones shifted subtly, maintaining surface friendliness while conveying undertones of threat that made my hands tighten on the steering wheel and my foot hover near the brake pedal. One driver, identifying herself as Jasmine, though the voice didn't match any Jasmine I'd met in 2 decades of trucking Alaska, asked whether I'd ever driven the old supply routes through the Brooks Range, referencing trails that hadn't been maintained since the 70s and shouldn't be known to anyone who hadn't worked these territories for at least 40 years. Her knowledge suggested either extensive historical research or personal experience that didn't match the age apparent in her voice, creating another impossible detail in an accumulating collection of things that shouldn't exist but clearly did. The convoy tightened formation at 12:38, closing distance until they were running maybe 50 feet behind my trailer, close enough that sudden braking on my part would guarantee collision, and close enough that their headlights flooded my cab with harsh illumination that made reading instruments difficult and created disorienting shadows across my dash. I requested more space using standard CB protocols, but received no response except continued tight formation and increased radio chatter that began incorporating phrases that repeated with mechanical precision. Feeding the road and what we bring together, cycling through their conversations in ways that felt ritualistic rather than conversational. At mile 143, the lead truck signaled an exit onto what appeared to be a service road I'd never noticed, despite running this route hundreds of times. The other 2 trucks moved to box me in, one pulling alongside in the passing lane and the other maintaining rear position, physically forcing me toward the exit through coordinated maneuvering that left me no safe options except compliance or deliberate collision. My mirrors showed their drivers as shadow shapes, featureless despite the strong illumination from multiple light sources, and in that moment I understood with absolute clarity that whatever controlled these trucks intended nothing good for me if I followed them off the main highway. The service road led toward a clearing visible maybe a quarter mile off the Dalton, and even from that distance I could see unnatural elements, geometric patterns marked in the ground, burned areas arranged too precisely to be random wildfire damage, vehicle wreckage scattered in formations that suggested deliberate placement rather than accident, accumulation. My radio erupted with voices overlapping, all repeating variations of invitation and command, insisting I needed to join them in the clearing, that the road demanded offerings, and I'd been selected to fulfill that obligation, that resistance would accomplish nothing except extending my terror before inevitable conclusion. I made my decision in the seconds before the forced turnoff, slamming brakes and cranking my wheel hard left while simultaneously dropping gears to kill momentum. The truck alongside couldn't react quickly enough, overshooting my position, and I used that momentary gap to punch accelerator and swerve back onto the main highway, my trailer fishtailing violently, but maintaining connection while I fought to regain control and build speed. My mirrors showed the convoy attempting to follow, but their coordination had broken, vehicles responding independently now rather than moving as a single unit, and I gained enough distance to make pursuit difficult on the winding highway sections ahead. I drove straight through to Coldfoot without additional stops, maintaining maximum safe speed and monitoring all mirrors obsessively for any sign of those trucks returning. My CB stayed active on Channel 19, normal traffic and weather reports confirming I'd reconnected with legitimate communications rather than whatever had hijacked Channel 17 for those hours. Other drivers responded to my check-ins with appropriate conversation, details that varied naturally rather than repeating in mechanical patterns, and gradually my breathing returned to something approaching normal, despite continued adrenaline surge making my hands shake and my vision too sharp. The Alaska State Troopers took my report seriously when I reached Coldfoot, documenting details and checking their records for trucks matching the descriptions I provided. No registrations existed for the company logos I'd seen. No dispatch records showed legitimate traffic matching those call signs, and their investigation eventually concluded I'd encountered either an elaborate hoax or misidentified details during high-stress conditions created by smoke and fatigue. But I kept my dashcam footage showing those impossible synchronized movements, and I know what I experienced during those hours can't be explained by exhaustion or atmospheric distortions. I still run the Dalton regularly because bills require income, and this remains the work I know best. But I never respond to convoy invitations on Channel 17 anymore, and I've learned to trust my instincts when situations feel wrong, regardless of how innocent they appear on the surface. Other drivers have shared similar stories when conversations turn to unexplained encounters, tales of trucks that move wrong, and voices that repeat patterns human speech shouldn't follow. And while we don't talk about it openly in mixed company, those of us who've experienced these things recognize each other through carefully worded questions and knowing looks. If you sensed something deeply wrong but couldn't identify concrete evidence justifying your fear, would you follow that instinct or talk yourself into staying calm? My name is Xander, and before February 2024, I believed I understood the fundamental nature of time and space well enough to navigate through temporary disruptions without questioning my grip on reality. 16 years hauling freight across Alaska's northern territories had exposed me to every variety of weather phenomenon the Arctic could generate, from temperature inversions that created false horizons to ice fog so dense it reduced visibility to arm's length within seconds. The Dalton Highway north of Coldfoot tested drivers constantly with conditions that would shut down operations in less extreme environments, and I developed both technical skills and mental resilience required to operate safely when most people would consider travel impossible. Whiteout conditions represented perhaps the most dangerous challenge. Complete loss of visual reference when snow and wind combined to eliminate boundaries between earth and sky, creating disorientation so profound that drivers could leave roadways without realizing they'd deviated from safe paths. Protocol demanded stopping and waiting during whiteouts, accepting delays rather than risking catastrophic navigation errors, and I'd followed that protocol religiously throughout my career until one February afternoon, when stopping somehow transported me into an experience that defied every law governing how consciousness and reality should interact. The run began Tuesday morning with a full load of pipe sections destined for Prudhoe Bay maintenance operations, weather forecasts predicting manageable conditions with possible snow squalls, but nothing suggesting the severe system that would develop by afternoon. I made good time through the initial 200 miles, stopping at Coldfoot for fuel and a meal before continuing north through increasingly heavy snow that reduced visibility gradually from miles to hundreds of yards to eventually just the immediate space surrounding my truck. By 4:15 in the afternoon, I'd reached a point roughly 15 miles north of Coldfoot where the whiteout became absolute, snow falling so densely while wind redistributed it horizontally that I literally could not distinguish ground from sky or determine which direction I was facing relative to the road. I pulled onto what I believed was the shoulder, engaging all brakes and emergency flashers, while settling in to wait for conditions to improve, as they inevitably did, within an hour or two at most. My cab remained warm and comfortable, engine idling to power heaters and electrical systems, and I had supplies sufficient for extended delays if necessary. The whiteout pressed against my windows like a physical substance. Whiteness so complete and featureless, it seemed to absorb, rather than reflect, light from my cab, creating the unsettling sensation that my truck existed in a void rather than on a highway in physical Alaska. I checked my phone, expecting no signal in these conditions, and found my assumption confirmed, then verified my GPS still showed my approximate position, even if updating slowly due to limited satellite visibility through the storm. I must have dozed, despite not intending to sleep, because suddenly I was checking my clock and discovering that 5.5 hours had passed since I'd stopped. The display showed 9:47 in the evening, well past the 20 minutes I'd subjectively experienced, and I had absolutely no memory of the intervening time beyond perhaps 20 minutes of sitting awake watching white nothingness outside my windows. More disturbing than the missing time was the continued whiteout, completely unchanged in intensity or character from when I'd first stopped, as if the storm had frozen in place rather than progressing through natural cycles of strengthening and weakening. Weather systems didn't behave this way. They evolved and moved, creating dynamic conditions that shifted even during severe events. This static, unchanging whiteness suggested something fundamentally wrong with either my perception or the environment itself. I tried my radio, cycling through CB channels and getting only silence, not even the static that normally filled unused frequencies. My phone showed the same time as my truck's clock, confirming at least that both systems agreed on temporal progression, even if my memory disagreed, but still displayed no signal and refused to connect to any networks. GPS had stopped updating entirely, frozen on coordinates that presumably represented where I'd been when satellite contact was lost. Every electronic system functioned from a hardware perspective. Screens lit up, buttons responded, devices powered on and off appropriately, but none of them could connect to anything beyond my immediate vehicle, as if I'd driven into a bubble where electromagnetic signals simply ceased to exist. The whiteness outside possessed qualities I couldn't adequately describe, even as I tried to form coherent thoughts about what my eyes reported. It wasn't simply an absence of features or extreme density of falling snow. It was an active whiteness, a presence rather than an absence, something that seemed to have substance and intention despite being technically nothing more than water crystals suspended in air. Depth perception failed completely. I couldn't determine if my windows looked out on snow falling inches away or miles distant. Couldn't judge whether the whiteness was close enough to touch or impossibly far away. My sense of up and down began to waver, gravity feeling optional rather than constant, as if my truck might at any moment decide to drift upward or sideways because physics had taken a break from enforcement. I made the decision to exit my cab and physically confirm my truck's position relative to the road, needing tactile verification that I remained grounded to actual Earth rather than floating in whatever void the whiteout had become. Opening my door required significant effort, not because mechanisms had frozen, but because some part of me understood that crossing the threshold between my cab's interior and the whiteness outside represented a boundary I might not successfully recross. The cold hit immediately, temperature far below what my last check had shown. Air so frigid it crystallized moisture in my nose and made my lungs ache with each inhalation. But more disturbing than the temperature was the silence. Complete absence of sound beyond my own breathing and heartbeat. No wind noise despite visible snow movement. No distant traffic sounds or natural environmental audio. Just utterly dead silence that felt oppressive and wrong. I took 3 steps away from my truck, maintaining contact with the doorframe with my left hand while extending my right into the whiteness, and in those 3 steps I lost all visual reference to my vehicle. It simply vanished, erased from existence by the white void, and panic surged as I realized I'd made a catastrophic error by leaving the safety of my cab. I pulled myself back along my extended arm, following the lifeline of my own limb back to where the door frame should be. And after subjective eternities of groping through nothingness, my hand contacted metal. I hauled myself back into my cab and slammed the door, heart hammering and breath coming in gasps, while I tried to process what had just happened. The truck's interior looked subtly wrong. Details shifted in ways I couldn't quite identify but definitely noticed. My seat position seemed different, adjusted forward or backward by perhaps an inch. Items I'd left on the passenger seat had moved, my thermos now on the dashboard where I definitely hadn't placed it. Paperwork shuffled into different stacks than I remembered arranging them. The truck smelled different too, some combination of scents I couldn't name but didn't recognize as belonging to my vehicle, and the temperature inside felt wrong, despite the heater showing normal operation and appropriate settings. I sat there for an indeterminate period, could have been minutes or hours, my sense of time having become as unreliable as my sense of space, staring at instruments and trying to convince myself that rational explanations existed for everything I'd experienced. Memory gaps from microsleeps due to fatigue, disorientation from sensory deprivation in the whiteout conditions, panic responses triggering false perceptions, and paranoid interpretations of normal variations in how things appeared. But even as I constructed these rational frameworks, I knew they didn't adequately explain the totality of the experience, didn't account for the way reality felt different in fundamental ways that went beyond simple perceptual errors. The whiteout cleared at 11:03, lifting suddenly rather than gradually as weather systems normally dissipated. The white void replaced instantly by normal night darkness and visible stars overhead. My immediate surroundings looked correct. I was parked, safely on the shoulder, no other vehicles visible but the road clearly marked and navigable. I started my engine and continued north to Prudhoe Bay, completed my delivery, and returned south on different schedule and routing than originally planned because I couldn't bring myself to stop anywhere near that same location during the return trip. The experience fundamentally altered how I think about consciousness and reality and the relationship between the two. Rational frameworks that had served me adequately for 46 years suddenly seemed inadequate to explain certain phenomena, and I found myself considering possibilities I'd previously dismissed as fantasy or delusion. Perhaps reality isn't as solid as we assume. Perhaps consciousness doesn't occupy fixed positions in space and time the way we believe. Perhaps boundaries between possible and impossible are more permeable than physics textbooks admit. The whiteout revealed cracks in the facade of certainty I'd constructed around my understanding of existence, and once seen, those cracks couldn't be ignored or forgotten no matter how much I wanted to return to comfortable ignorance. I still drive Alaska routes because the work pays well, and alternative careers at my age don't offer comparable income. But I've stopped pretending I understand the environment I operate within. The North holds mysteries that defy rational explanation, and certain conditions create opportunities for those mysteries to intrude into normal existence in ways that permanently change how aware people perceive reality. I drive more carefully now, pay closer attention to subtle wrongness in my surroundings, trust instincts over logic when the two conflict. And I never again stop in whiteout conditions if any possibility exists of continuing movement to reach shelter or clearer weather, because stopping means surrendering to whatever those white voids contain. And I'm not confident I'd survive a second encounter with whatever exists in the spaces between snow and sky where normal rules temporarily cease to apply, when everything you trust about reality suddenly feels negotiable. How do you decide what's real? 9 drivers, 9 encounters that challenged everything we think we know about Alaska's remote highways. The truckers who shared these stories survived their ordeals, but countless others have vanished into the wilderness, their fates sealed by phenomena we can't explain and forces we barely comprehend. These roads stretch across the most isolated terrain in North America, where help is hours away and darkness reigns for months. If you've experienced something on Alaska's highways that defies explanation, share your story in the comments below. And if these tales have left you unsettled, hit that subscribe button and join the Unheard Fears community for more true horror from the frozen north. Until next time, stay vigilant out there. And remember, in Alaska, you're never truly alone on the road.